I have been reading a new book called God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou, and have been struck by how much attention it has received across the British media, widely reviewed and picked up quite extensively across the BBC. It is a good book, it's a very good read, it is lightly and richly written, full of scholarship and knowledge of its subject, which is the ancient world of the Levant and how God was depicted both in the Bible and in surrounding cultures as well. I also had a conversation with Francesca Stavrakopoulou on BBC Radio 3's programme Free Thinking, across really quite profound divides in fact, and that's left me with a few further thoughts which weren't covered off in the programme that I wanted to add now, because the book is quite explicitly written with an atheistic agenda, and I think that's worth challenging, because the risk always is with that agenda that it reduces discussions, particularly around religion and theology, to a question of power. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? In God and Anatomy, it's quite clear who the bad guys are. They're those new Christians, and also Plato, who is singled out for introducing abstraction into the Western mind, and so alienating us from the cosmos, turning gods into mere human projections. Now, I think this is neither true of Plato or indeed the way that projections work. So let me just pick up the issue of projections first of all, because as Donald Winnicott, the British psychotherapist, noticed, if we exist merely by projecting from our inner lives onto the world around us, we would end up living only in our internal fantasies and become completely dislocated from reality. And at a personal level, that would mean we were all living in more or less psychotic versions of our inner life, taking that to be real, when, whilst that does happen, and we can certainly be mistaken about reality, what we project onto the world must land on reality, Winnicott said, and at least some of the time resonate with reality, as it were reflecting back to us with the sense that we are in reality, that we're grounded, that we're connected, that we can know something of the inner life of the world because it is felt in our own inner lives as well. So projection goes on, but it is true projection, at least enough of the time you might say, and so can be discerned and then reflected upon, built up into true accounts of the reality round and about. Important to stress because apart from the implication that human beings are thoroughly deluded, it also fosters this social fragmentation because it feeds the idea that we can't really connect with one another because we're only driven by our strivings to make sense of the world for ourselves, for our grasping after power, and so turning reality into this zero-sum game where people are either for us or against us. So projections as the easy explanation for why human beings feel they perceive deities, divinities, God around and about is one theory to knock on its head. It is too easy. There's much more going on inside our lives and the way that we connect with the world around about us. Though I know that in the academy, projections are the go-to explanation for why poor, particularly primitive human beings have believed in deities. But let's spend a bit more time on the common critique in the academy too of Plato, because by reflecting upon that, I think actually we find a way back to connection with the cosmos, to realizing that our lives and the cosmic life are deeply interconnected, which was Plato's key message, in fact. And I'll do that by picking up on three expressions that appear in Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book, relating to Plato, Platonic abstractions, as she puts it, then the idea that Plato thought that the spiritual world was immaterial, and then thirdly, the idea that the drive in the aftermath of Platonic thought, widely taken up into those bad Christians' theories about theology too, is that God is utterly and completely separate from the cosmos, and so leaving it impossible to see any true likeness of the divine, particularly in our embodied existence, which is the subject of the book. So first of all, this idea of Platonic abstractions. I think one of the key ways that this mistake gets made is by Plato's use of the word theory, because now the word theory does precisely mean an abstract proposition that is then put to the test by ideally empirical means. Whereas for Plato, there was a very different theory of knowledge that obtained, and theory, theoria, primarily means a mode of contemplation. And the point about contemplation is that you tune in with your own inner life to the life of what you are studying, and by that resonance, true insights about the object of study become possible. In fact, it's not even really an object of study. Your subjectivity joins with the subjectivity of the world around. And then, sure enough, words, amongst other things, might come to mind that express something of that realization, something of the insights that come through that kind of active theorizing. It's very different from the dead notion of theories that can be abstracted, say, into mathematical equations or logical statements, which is the dominant way that theories are considered today. For Plato, logoi, forms, ideas, words that he also uses are, I think, much more like angels as they became in the Christian tradition. They're living intelligences, dynamically making and remaking and energizing and pouring the divine life into the various levels of reality. Reality was understood to be comprised of a kind of great chain of being that linked all living things to the source and origin of all living things. And so words, as we speak, are part of that, and it still carries a resonance even today, because the words aren't just sounds on the air. They're not even forms on the air, but they carry a living meaning, particularly when they're spoken well. And that connects more directly back to Plato's idea of both logoi, words, and theory too. So whenever you hear the expression Platonic abstractions, you know that something is being misunderstood. It's also why Plato, I think, was very, very wary of writing. He preferred the spoken form. He recognized that the trouble with writing is that you lose the living sense of connection with the world around you, which you spontaneously get when you hear someone speak, because it takes you out of yourself. The trouble with writing is that it takes you into yourself in order to understand what's on the page. The meaning must be conjured up, eventually silently, if the word isn't actually read out. And so that always risks alienating the reader from the world around and about, which was part of Plato's worry and suspicion about writing. Instead for him, words are always a mode of recollecting our true nature. Hopefully they trigger, they inspire, they communicate wider perceptions about the nature of reality. Quite the opposite from abstractions. Secondly, this idea that Plato thought spiritual reality was immaterial. Well, there's a number of ways into this to remake it. One is to think about what's sometimes called the pneuma theory, which Plato, in common with many philosophers and thinkers across the ancient world, adopted, pneuma being the ancient Greek for, well, not just spirit, but also breath and wind. And the pneuma theory was precisely an account of how pneuma could hold these three manifestations. And it was considered through pneumatology, through breathing in, and the wind of the cosmos, which was taken to be coming straight from the divine source, is breathed into us and in our lungs as breath, becomes manifest in its third form, which is as spirit, and so becomes the vital force that sustains us. And so you can see by this movement from the divine wind that we breathe in as our breath, becoming the inner spirit of our life itself, pneuma carrying these three meanings, is the very action that connects us to the world round and about. And it connects us materially and spiritually. That split didn't really obtain in the ancient world. It's very much a modern anachronistic reading, a dualism that didn't really appear until the scientific revolution, when the world was presumed to be dead matter, devoid of living spirit. Plato, in common with others, thinks of it very differently. And that comes up particularly in his dialogue, the Timaeus, which is all about how the cosmic body can be understood to share dynamics with the human body. The challenge it faces is how the human body, along with all other bodies in what we would call the natural world, are in a process of becoming. They're mortal, they grow and they die. And how that becoming can therefore be a likeness or an image of the eternal being is the challenge that Timaeus, in his great speech in the eponymous dialogue of Plato, takes to heart. It's very interesting that it's there he uses the image of the demiurge, the divine craftsman, this famous part of Platonic philosophy. Famous, but often forgotten, that of course the demiurge is a divine craftsman. It's precisely a making of form that reflects the divine being that the demiurge undertakes. And moreover, Plato's very clear that the demiurge's desire, which means a power for the people, is to fill the natural world with all the goodness of the divine. It's to connect us to divine life that the demiurge, the craftsman, works on the cosmic body and our body in order to experience divine life. And that's why the speech is full of all sorts of analogies and associations, sympathies, which we in our own bodies and by contemplating the bodies of that which are around us can awaken to the divine source and origin which fills and fills out the universe itself. We've got to overcome other anachronisms to enter into this story. One is the word physical and physicality, another common word in Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book, because it doesn't mean what we take it to mean now, the dead atoms of the material world that are held together by the forces described in modern physics. Even actually the Epicureans' atoms were very different from the atoms of contemporary discussion. For example, the Epicureans were very clear that there were soul atoms as much as the heavier, grosser atoms that make up the tangible side of life. For the Epicureans, all that atom meant was that the universe must be broken down into parts that ultimately can't disappear into the infinitesimally small, because otherwise you'd have nothing, and how can something come out of nothing? It didn't imply the mechanistic model of the cosmos, which is the dominant model today. And so they had soul atoms as well as the grosser material atoms that we touch with the empirical senses. By tuning in with the spiritual senses, this wider reality can come into view. And that is very much part of Plato's aim, especially in the Timaeus, to awaken our inner eye to that wider cosmic body so that we can see through it, see how it transmits, see how it's much more than it immediately seems, and so, nowadays, do this re-mythologizing and help us to connect us to the cosmos, to the natural world once more. And so when you hear that Plato thought the spiritual world was immaterial, you know something is being misunderstood. And understanding what's being misunderstood can lead you back to this wider vision. Which takes me to the third accusation made against poor Plato that is so wrong, which is the idea that divine life, divine reality, is utterly unlike material reality, the world that you and I most immediately consciously inhabit. There's a distance between us and the divine, it's said, as the divine transcendence takes it over the horizon of perception. Clearly an important dynamic for atheists, because once the divine disappears over the horizon of perception, it can be inferred that the divine doesn't exist at all. But this is not what Plato meant. We've already seen some of that in relation to the Timaeus and the demiurge's key aim to create a world and a cosmos that precisely is the image and likeness of the divine life, so that becoming can know of its being too. In a monotheistic frame, you might ask yourself, what else could monotheism mean but that everything is held within the one life of God? If there were parts of the cosmos that weren't in the divine life, then that would mean that God weren't monotheistic. God weren't omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. There were parts of the created world that had fallen away from God, which would mean there were parts of the universe independent of God, which is an impossibility. Which is why, for example, Dante in the Divine Comedy, even on the floor of hell, detects the divine light and crawls onto the body of Lucifer in order to begin the ascent. If God weren't even there, then Lucifer would just fall out of existence altogether. That's what Christian Platonism has understood. Where Christianity, I think, has come a little more unstuck is with the energy that Plato argued enables us to see that, which is the erotic energy. Christianity famously has a problem with Eros. I think it's been well understood by the scholar Kyle Harper when he pointed out that the trouble set in when Paul used sexual activity to distinguish between Roman notions of freedom and Christian notions of freedom. He does this in places like the letter to the Romans. And what Paul wanted to do was show that whereas Roman freedom, the freedom of being a citizen and a free man, was very commonly expressed by sexual choice, essentially, if you were free, you could choose whose bodies you used sexually. Paul wanted to show that the new Christian freedom was actually not through identification as a Roman citizen, but was through identification as being part of the kingdom of God, key to its spreading around the Roman world. But with this unfortunate legacy that it casts sexual expression in a bad light. Plato, though, didn't have that problem. For him, Eros is absolutely central to his philosophy, as he describes in many of his dialogues, particularly dialogues like the Lysis, the Symposium, and the Phaedrus. And the reason why Eros so fascinated Plato is because he realised it is the dynamic within us that awakens us to that which is good, beautiful, and true, and when directed aright, can lead us to that which is good, beautiful, and true. So one of the things that Eros's perception of what's beautiful enables in its fullest form is that everything ultimately is simple. Everything reflects the divine beauty in the manifold forms of beauty that we see round and about us. Eros is a kind of inner sight that can pick up that divine simplicity. And that's why the notion of simplicity became so important in Christian Platonism, in the ideas about God that theologians developed. it's a simplicity that's not a reduction, that's not a denial of multiplicity. Quite the opposite. It's the simplicity that enables the divine to be in all things. So hence when you might read that God has no body, the imperative behind that is that therefore God can be in all bodies. And of course, God is not only said to have no body, God is sometimes said to have a body too. The seeming contradiction pointing towards the reality that the inner eye can understand how God is both within and without all things. The analogy which makes a lot of sense to me is when you think about a parent and its relationship to the child. The parent must be at once both deeply empathetic and able to understand the life of the child in embodied forms as much as anything else, but also to be more than just the life of the child. Otherwise, it couldn't help the child and guide it into adult life. The parent is at once utterly immanent in the child's life, but also transcendent from the child's life. And so the divine is, in relation to us, immanent within our life, but also transcendent in order that we can grow into that transcendent appreciation of life, which Plato understood particularly through the idea of beauty. If we follow that line, it takes us to the divine, where we recognise the simplicity that fills all things. Goodness is another reflection upon this. Goodness, when it's not seen as the opposite of badness, again, this kind of power dynamic, this zero-sum game that so often infects conversations now, but rather goodness that arrives at clarity. It can see the good in all things and so orientate and align to the goodness in all things. Not always an easy thing to do, especially when we are suffering, but, promises Plato, by conjuring our desire, our quest, our yearning, our passion, we can find this clarity and so see the good which is in all things, and also therefore see the truth of all things, the good, the beautiful and the true. And the point about truth is that it is at once a satisfaction of this eros. Eros, love, makes us strive for all sorts of things in the hope that we'll find satisfaction with them, which we do until the satisfaction wanes and we're back on the erotic journey again. But there is a truth, Plato knew, that satisfies the eros, and then eros changes. Then eros becomes the desire to communicate what it has discovered back to the world, which is why in his myth of the cave, Plato has the person who finds their way out of the darkness of the cave by following the beautiful and good life and the beautiful and good light and seeing the truth of the sun. Their next act is the one to return to the cave to tell their fellows about what's good, beautiful and true. So when you hear that Plato thought that divine life is completely unlike anything in the cosmos, you know something's been misunderstood. And go to this idea of eros and how it can lead us to that which is good, beautiful and true. And then you'll find the truth of what Plato is saying, and also find a way of beginning to overcome this terrible alienation and demythologizing that so fragments the modern world. It's perhaps just worth asking, who's to blame for this misunderstanding of Plato, which really only takes hold in the middle part of the 20th century. I think that modern Christians, coming up against the demands of liberal attitudes towards sexuality, pass the buck back to Plato in an effort to overcome their own discomfort at the difficulties the Christian tradition does have with erotic love. That's one source, which is very often why you can read in theology departments, in books by biblical scholars and so on, that Plato is the source of Christian ills in this respect. I hope you're half persuaded it's not true. I think Karl Popper is another source of this misunderstanding in the middle part of the 20th century. He famously wrote The Open Society, portraying Plato as a kind of tyrant who would rule us all, and that those in a free society must throw off. But it's Also worth remembering that later in his life, when Popper came to write his autobiography, he explicitly says that he wrote that during the Second World War from New Zealand without much access to texts and translations of Plato. So he went on his own assumptions, which he says in his autobiography were biased. Now, he does add that there's no unbiased translation of Plato, but he uses Plato as a target for his projections to try to understand the tyrannies which were so horribly shaping the world during the Second World War. And what's so unfortunate is that Popper's book became hugely read, and I think often because scholars don't really read Plato, in fact. This is a slightly shocking thing to say, but I do sometimes wonder that, how you can possibly read the Timaeus, for example, and come to the conclusion that Plato didn't like cosmic and human bodies. They take Karl Popper at face value, perhaps haven't read the autobiography where Popper himself complicates what he was saying. But this comment about not reading Plato really came clear to me when I read Owen Barfield after having done my PhD on Plato. Because my PhD on Plato, which I got, left me most consciously with the sense that I hadn't actually understood what Plato was going on about by engaging with him in this rather abstract, immaterial, analytical, modern way. And what Barfield remarked is that in order to understand Plato, we moderns have first of all to unthink everything that we think we know about Plato. And then Plato's truth might start to come back to us. And theory is one of the words that Barfield lands on. And he notes that theory now means an abstract proposition that can be put to the test, not an active contemplation of the world around us, which words and images and discussion, dialogue might bring to life for us. And I think this matters not just as a kind of scholarly tiff about Plato, but because it goes to the heart of the modern condition and the need to re-mythologize the world. We need to experience our bodies once again, not as biological robots, but as porous to the world around us, which actually was the point that we got to in our discussion on the radio program. We need to know that our feelings are not just chemical reactions, but are communicating something. We need to experience our life as energetic, because that then carries us into the energies that are around and about. But also we need this clarity of sight, which we humans are capable of, that can see the good, beautiful and true, can see the simplicity that lies within all the diversity, because that then awakens the divinity, the resting place, the ground of our being for us. It brings it to mind and so offers the resting place for our striving, which is the only long-term antidote to rampant consumption, destruction of the environment, as Eros runs out of control. Even our becoming, even our material reality, figures like Plato realized, can come to our aid in that respect, because as we contemplate the side of us that is living and then dying, that is rising and falling, that's part of the cycles which are so evident, the eye of the mind, the ears of understanding that take in, the deeper touch and felt qualities with which we experience life, can help us to see that life is bigger than death and that divine life contains all life. We can recognize, even in our bodies, maybe especially in our bodies because they're close to us, that they are expressions of the image and the likeness of God, and so find a path to a far richer consciousness.